Chers collègues, nous allons commencer. Now, do not be worried. The session is in English. Mais je vous rappelle que le Conseil national des archives est une organisation avec deux langues de travail, qui sont l'anglais, bien sûr, que nous pratiquons largement dans nos réunions, mais également le français. Et donc, j'espère que vous avez tous des écouteurs, puisque je vais commencer par présenter les sujets et les orateurs en français, et puis ensuite, large place sera faite à l'anglais pendant toute cette séance. Mais nous commençons en français. Commençons en français en vous rappelant d'abord les règles d'échange qui prévalent lors de ces réunions. Nous devons nous présenter et échanger sur les différents sujets que nous traitons de façon respectueuse, et il est donc important que nous puissions écouter ce que disent les autres et réagir de façon normale et respectueuse par rapport à leurs propos, que nous soyons d'accord ou non. Je vous rappelle que nous avons également un espace de repos, a breathing room, qui est prévu pour ceux d'entre nous qui seraient en désaccord par rapport à des propos ou qui seraient dans une situation émotionnelle un peu compliquée par rapport à ce qu'ils auraient entendu. Donc c'est pour cela que cet espace a été prévu. Mais je veux tout de suite maintenant entrer dans le sujet essentiel que nous allons traiter aujourd'hui. Alors, c'est l'avenir de notre profession, hein. Il ne faut pas se cacher derrière la réalité. La prochaine génération d'archives numériques, c'est celle avec laquelle nous devons vivre, nous vivons déjà, et c'est bien ce qui va nous être présenté par nos trois intervenants. Nos trois intervenants qui vont nous parler d'archives numériques du Pacifique, de l'intendance numérique complète et des problématiques d'utilisation d'outils numériques pour libérer le potentiel des archives. Et je donne donc la parole successivement, d'abord à Mark Crookston, qui est actuellement le numéro 2 de la Bibliothèque nationale Alexander Turnbull à la Bibliothèque nationale de Nouvelle-Zélande, qui a occupé au sein de notre organisation plusieurs fonctions, comme en particulier secrétaire général de Parbica, qui est encore membre du groupe d'experts pour l'évaluation et qui a occupé différents postes au Royaume-Uni, en Nouvelle-Zélande et dans le Pacifique. Deuxième intervenant, Somaya Langley, qui travaille actuellement à la Bibliothèque universitaire de Sydney, qui présente un projet qu'elle a développé à la Bibliothèque universitaire de Cambridge, qui travaille sur le lien entre archives et technologies autour des contenus culturels et les défenses des contenus numériques auprès d'agences australiennes et ailleurs, et donc qui a été chargée d'un projet de recherche en politique et planification de la conservation numérique à l'université de Cambridge de 2016 à 2018. Et enfin, Catherine Dan, qui est l'intervenante que je connais depuis le plus longtemps, puisque nous avons été ensemble au sein du comité directeur de SPA, qui est à l'heure actuelle l'archiviste de l'université nationale australienne, qui a occupé plusieurs postes, qui a été présidente de l'association des archivistes australiens, qui a été trésorière et secrétaire de SPA, et qui est à l'heure actuelle la représentante australienne auprès du comité du bouclier bleu. Voilà, donc très rapidement une présentation des trois intervenants, et dès maintenant je vais donc donner la parole à Mark Crookston pour sa présentation sur les archives numériques du Pacifique. Je vous remercie.
Better. Merci, Henri. I'd like to acknowledge the Ganya people on whose land I stand, and ko kapukata mahaka toku ko kapukata mahaka te monga ko ofeo te awa no otipoti aho ko Mark Crookston toku ingoa no reira tēnā koutou tēnā tātou katoa. That was my mihi in Te Reo Māori, the indigenous language of New Zealand, and that positions me or situates me as being from Dunedin in the South Island of New Zealand under the shadow of Mount Cargill and beside the banks of the Leaf River. Earlier this year, the National Library of New Zealand was successful with its grant application to the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for what is entitled a Pacific Virtual Museum Pilot Program. This pilot program will develop and deliver an online aggregation service for Pacific documentary heritage that's already digitised and made accessible in memory institutions from around the region and potentially further afield, starting with photographic collections. It will be a service similar to other aggregation services known around the world, like Digital New Zealand, from where I am, Trove from the National Library of Australia, Europeana, or the Digital Public Library of America, and there's many from around the world. But it'll be focused specifically on Pacific documentary heritage. It'll be a digital space to connect diverse and dispersed people with the digitised taonga, or the documentary heritage from their place and relating to them. And also there'll be, from that service, we're intending to build some educational programs for, in collaboration with Pacific educators. So the project is just being initiated. It will be implemented by the National Library of New Zealand in partnership with the National Library of Australia. It'll run through to the end of 2021, during which time I'm confident we would have found sustainable funding for the service. We've actually built into our budget a role and some money to source sustainable funding. So just to note, the Pacific Virtual Museum was the name of the funding proposal. I use the term archive in the title of this talk as a mechanism to engage with this audience in a professional archive setting, but the actual name of the service is still to be confirmed, as it's something we want to collaborate with our co-design group on. So I was intending this presentation to show the first developments of the service and to talk about our experiences of co-design so far. But we're just taking a bit of time to get the recruitment and the project initiation right. So one of the challenges in terms of timing with conferences is that you put an abstract together about 3 or 4 months before the actual conference, and I was really confident we'd be up and going by now. So instead, I'm going to take the opportunity to explore the drivers and the timing of this project that sort of articulate why it's important for now, and end with some questions for you to hopefully seed some discussion later in a professional archival setting about what some of the challenges are that we're likely to see coming and that we're going to engage with our co-design group on. So as with most new multinational initiatives, timing and context is critical to understanding the project. And the first strand of the several strands for this project that have come together to make it possible starts in Moana Nui a Kiwa, the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Libraries Network describes itself as a dynamic group of emerging and experienced leaders from across the Pacific, including library practitioners, innovators, mentors, representatives of library associations, and partnering institutions focused on developing leadership and priorities in library services around the Pacific. It grew out of an INELI-funded program for emerging library leaders. And if you don't know what INELI is, I-N-E-L-I, it's a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation program designed to support emerging library leaders to redesign and reimagine the future of library services. These leaders wanted to build a collaborative network together to address key systemic opportunities for Pacific libraries, including documentary heritage. This group acknowledged that other mechanisms to bring leaders, especially emerging leaders from across the Pacific, together were not working. The Pacific Libraries Network have met a couple of times, once in Fiji, and that's a picture of us in Fiji, and another time hosted by the State Library of Queensland. We're still in our infancy, but here's a few things that we have agreed. A vision to strengthen the impact of Pacific libraries to better support the needs of Pacific communities through collaborative networking and advocacy. A statement of intent with 8 goals relating to the role of libraries, but one specifically relevant to this project I'm talking about. Goal 7, ensuring equitable access to information to all by reducing digital divides, providing digital infrastructure, and giving access to digital resources. At the State Library of Queensland meeting, the Pacific Libraries Network agreed a strategic action plan. We discussed various options for delivering digital access to Pacific resources. And it was agreed to pursue a digital archive or digital aggregation type service. Pacific representatives spoke of the challenges with digitisation, resources, storage, managing access channels, etc., and how if there was a discovery and access layer provided collaboratively, that would then support their chances for funding for digitisation within their jurisdictions or organisations. So we had the strong support from Pacific Libraries leaders to make something happen in this space. We also got a letter of support from Pābika, the Pacific branch of the International Council on Archive, whose conference we're at here, whose most people from Pābika are actually speaking next door at the moment. So we had this sort of Pacific leaders' support for it. And the next strand was the National Library of New Zealand and why we are interested in this project and where we're coming from. So there's a few reasons for that. The project aligns well with the purposes and strategic priorities of the National Library of New Zealand. For example, there's 2 legislative purposes of the library that are up there: to enrich cultural and economic life of New Zealand and its interchanges with other nations, so there's sort of a partnership and collaborative priority there, and to develop research services in the field of New Zealand and Pacific studies. We've always been established. In fact, the Alexander Turnbull Library, which is part of the National Library, is 100 years old and was built on a foundation of New Zealand and Pacific studies. So Aotearoa New Zealand is a Pacific country with a diverse and growing Pacific population. The National Library has a priority to seek stronger relationships with Pacific cultures to improve services and ensure the documentary heritage of Pacific people in New Zealand is preserved. And according to the library's relatively recent strategic directions, turning knowledge into value, one of the key priorities is with all of our work, is to either build a network to help make our priorities happen, or to engage as part of an existing network. So not do anything in isolation or siloed. And in addition, some statistics to support the Pacific priority for the National Library of New Zealand are approximately 8% of New Zealand's population are self-identified as Pacific people. For some cultures, the New Zealand population is substantially greater than the population on the home islands. For example, 79% of Niueans, 77% of Cook Island Māori, and 62% of Samoans are born in New Zealand. Pacific people remain the major ethnic group in New Zealand with the highest proportion of children, so 0 to 14-year-olds. And in New Zealand, that's 36%. So 36% of people in New Zealand, aged 0 to 13, are Pacific people. 36%, of all people 0 to 14 identify as Pacific. And this is huge. Out of 8% of the population, there's 36% in that age group. So in a very short space of time, New Zealand, the demographics of New Zealand are going to be very strongly Pacific-centred. And not a lot of people know that in New Zealand, unless you live in South Auckland, where quite a significant proportion of the Pacific population are. So the library had a mandate and a community of Pacific people to serve. And we also have a strategic vision to build collaborative knowledge networks for library services and documentary heritage. So this all sort of fits nicely with our priorities. We also have this, which is Digital New Zealand. It was launched in 2008 and was one of the early international archival or content aggregators. And like most aggregators, it brings together metadata from a range of archival sources to present a joint discovery experience for digitised archives. Usually a small image and a limited amount of metadata, and then directs the researcher to the collection management pages of the host institution. The underlying software for Digital New Zealand is called Supplejack. It's the harvesting and sharing and searching software. And it has been used by many organisations in New Zealand and further afield as an archival or documentary heritage discovery experience for collections that are usually dispersed or managed in different areas. So very briefly, the Europeana 1914 to 1918 discovery experience was built on Supplejack. Seismic up there, that one, that's a digital archive of experiences of the Christchurch and Canterbury earthquakes from 2010 and 2011. The New Zealand Taonga Sound and Vision, the New Zealand Film and Sound Archive, have built their discovery experience on using Supplejack, etc. So we have this excellent sort of technology infrastructure for bringing collections together. And importantly, Digital New Zealand also harvests from Trove, from the National Library of Australia. So there are pathways for bringing together Pacific items from around Australian cultural institutions into the project as well, via Trove or via directly through Digital New Zealand. But there's obviously a whole lot of work to do to engage with Australian institutions, and that may include you, if you're in this audience, who have Pacific collections and want to be involved in the project. So we have sort of this Pacific mandate, and we have a National Library of New Zealand who are really keen. We've got our own mandate and priorities, and we have a technology infrastructure to support it, but we were missing one key ingredient, and that was money. And this is where the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade come in. And I'm not an employee of DFAT or the Australian government, so I can't speak to them, for them, or their motivations. But the Australian Foreign Affairs Pacific Step Up strategy is publicly accessible. And the grant opportunity, which is a screenshot of that up there, for which the National Library was successful, was obviously made available in the context of that Pacific Step Up strategy. And my engagement with DFAT started when they were part of those Pacific Library Network discussions that I mentioned earlier. And it's been really obvious through our engagement with DFAT that the Australian government shares our commitment to the education and societal memory outcomes of the project. So we were successful with that grant opportunity, which was great. But what are we actually going to do? So the project is for 2.5 years, and we're just recruiting the team now to lead us through it. We're also in the process of establishing a co-design group from around the region with a focus on Pacific archivists and librarians, educators and research from across the islands and in Australia and New Zealand. This group will work with us through the duration of the project to help sort of design the service. And our first design workshop is planned for December this year, or tentatively planned for December this year. The technology development is comparatively easy, given the existing Digital New Zealand infrastructure, and that many collections are already part of the Digital New Zealand API. Pacific collections are already part of that. But most of the work of this project and the costs of the project, of this digital project, is for engaging with the humans. And that's where that co-design group I've referenced a few times comes in. But there's a range also of content partners and organisations and institutions who will have Pacific collections who may want to get involved with the project as well, and that will involve a lot of engagement. So with that engagement in mind and all ahead of us, I thought I'd ask some questions of this audience, of you, in a professional archival setting, which may be interesting for us when we have question time, or may hopefully seed some thoughts for discussion with me later. I'll make myself available. Please come up and talk to me later. Many archival collections of Western institutions, especially in a post-colonial context, are biased. And I think we saw that this morning explained better than what I can explain it now. But that bias plays out in many ways, not least of all in our descriptive practices, either inherited from the past and mostly still going on today. These practices can negatively reinforce colonial power structures and dehumanise the people and cultures represented in the collections. The unidentified, as a title of a photograph of Indigenous people, is pervasive. What's obvious when looking at these images is that they're taken from a palangi, or a white person, as said in Polynesian languages, perspective, usually in an anthropological context or as a means to display and distribute as curiosities. These are all from the collections of my own institution, from the National Library of New Zealand, but we know they exist throughout the region and throughout the world. It's quite dehumanising, I think, to see unidentified as a title of a person, or with the one in the middle, a collection. There's one European person or US person in that centre photo, and he's named Sergeant Kennard, and the rest are just unidentified Fijian people. So I have questions for you. I want to know, and I got some answers earlier with the session on Mukutu, but what are some of the great examples you've seen with digital archives that acknowledge and address these biases? And what are some ways you've seen that can provide a culturally safe digital experience for people to engage with digital collections that could be distressing? And also, if you're from an institution that has specific collections and would be interested in getting involved, please come and talk to me and let me know what it would take for you to get involved, or whether you already have your Pacific collections available in a content aggregator anywhere in the world. Alternatively, if you're a researcher or have researchers interested in Pacific collections, you might have good perspectives to engage with us from. And one of the key questions we're going to be engaging with our co-design group on is, what should it look like and how should it feel? In many ways, this is a question of how aggregation services work best as a discovery mechanism. Single search boxes, separate country pages. Should we do all of this? Aggregators have been around for a while now, and I'm interested in the views of you guys on how best to progress this model and not just replicate something else that exists. I've got a couple of sort of sample images here that we're going to use in our first co-design conversation, just to provide an example of what this kinds of thing might look like. What countries to and what territories to include in or not is going to be a particularly interesting conversation. So to summarise and conclude, the National Library of New Zealand is partnering with the National Library of Australia to develop a Pacific Virtual Museum pilot. Although the name is still to be confirmed, we know it's going to be an aggregation of Pacific documentary heritage already digitised and available, focused on photographs to start with from around the region and maybe from around the world. It's funded by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. It's wanted by Pacific library and archival leaders. It's an opportunity to take another step in the design of digital archive aggregators, and we'll be engaging with a range of Pacific people to make it happen. But also I'm really, really interested in what your views are on that as well. Kia ora.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much. And I think we will get a chance to exchange on all the questions you raise, which, relate to this great project. And I'm particularly interested by the second question you asked about the dehumanizing effect on putting material online. And so we'll come back to this. Pardon pour les interprètes. Je vous avais annoncé que je parlerai parfois en anglais. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Somaya Langley to present a paper on digital stewardship from start to finish. So
firstly, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Kaurna people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm Somaya Langley. I have worked at a number of different institutions in Australia, and I've also worked overseas. As you can see, it does say University of Cambridge there. I did the majority of this thinking and development work while involved in the digital preservation at Oxford and Cambridge project between 2016 and 2018. And that work was generously funded by the Polonsky Foundation, so they do need to be acknowledged in this forum, and I very much need to acknowledge the ICA too, because my participation here this week is partially supported by the ICA. The reason why the ICA supporting me here is that I'm one of the two new co-chairs of the expert group on managing digital and physical records, and my other co-chair is John Roberts, who is the Chief Privacy Officer and Archivist of Ontario, Canada. John can't be here today, or actually this week, so do come and talk to me if you care about digital and physical records and a whole lot of other things too, and maybe you'll want to come and talk to me after this presentation. Okay, so this is the outline. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on acknowledgements because I think this is important. This is not my work alone. And as I've said, I've worked in a number of places. I have done a lot of different contracts. I've seen a lot of things, but it is not without all of my peers and colleagues that this work actually develops. So I will talk about some people that have been involved very briefly. There's some terminology. I'm not going to get bogged down in that. Yes, why another model? Why do we need more models? But I think that what I will try and illustrate is that this is somewhat filling a gap in between high-level models and some more operational procedures. And so there are two parts to it. There's a workflow model and there is a matrix, which is a series of checklists. And so these tools that I'm speaking about are intended to assist people who are transitioning to digital archiving from more traditional training. And also, and I do mean this, these things don't come out of my imagination. These come out of hopefully evidence-based, but real-world scenarios. And part of what I've been working on is trying to visualise and illustrate to managers and senior executives what's actually involved in wrangling digital content, because it's easy to say, we're just going to build an aggregator service, or we just need to do some digital archiving, but what is actually involved at the coalface? So let's get going. These are three institutions that I have had the opportunity to work at, and these are some of the people that have been involved in helping me flesh out our ideas. Not everyone is listed up here, but I do want to thank Dave Gerard and Lee Pretlove, who were my Cambridge Digital Preservation and Oxford Cambridge side of the team. Dave and Lee have gone on to do other things. Lee is now doing a PhD at the University of Sheffield. My counterpart at Oxford, Edith Halvarson, and you need a sounding board. No matter who you are in what you do, you're needing a sounding board, and Edith has been that person to me and continues to be that person to me. Sarah Mason, who was formerly in Melbourne in Australia, and James Mooney, who is still in Oxford. This work would never have been possible had it not been for Emma Jolly, asking me to come and do some Born Digital collecting with her. And so Emma and Jonathan McCabe are both in the audience, either here or elsewhere, listening to other presentations. So do go and introduce yourselves as well, and also Douglas Elford. So they all work at the National Library of Australia, and two previous colleagues, Ian Gilmore and Matthew Davies from the National Film and Sound Archive, who are both now retired, and also Trevor Carter, who is, I did see, wandering around. So these are the people who have very much helped form this work. So you can't just put my name to it, you need to put everyone else's name to it. And there are more. There are many dozens of people whose ideas, people from the National Library of New Zealand, from Archives New Zealand, who I've built off the work of. And so I think it's really important. And I need to say too, I'm not a trained archivist, I'm not a trained librarian, I'm not a trained ICT professional. There's lots of things I'm not. So I'm kind of a jack of all trades, or a Jill of all trades, and I feel like I'm the sidekick. So hence the image up there, which is, this is Etta Candy, who was one of, I don't really know Wonder Woman all that well, so I may have taken some things out of context. But Etta Candy was one of Wonder Woman's sidekicks, and she has red hair in this image, so there you go, this is who I think I am. So let's talk about some terminology. Very quickly, you don't have to read these things. I don't expect you to read these things. No one should ever put this much text up on screen. These are three definitions taken from the Digital Preservation Coalition's glossary out of their DPC handbook, and also from the Digital Curation Centre. So, digital archiving, digital preservation, digital curation. I have heard these terms used over and over again interchangeably. They don't necessarily mean the same thing. Context is everything. If you take the word archiving out of this particular room and you put it in an ICT context, it means a very different thing. The same as if you use the word curation in a gallery context. So I think that there is an argument for some other terms. So let's not go down this rabbit hole, and instead let's move on to some more holistic. If anyone's had a conversation with me ever, you'll hear me bang on about needing to do holistic things. And so to me, digital stewardship is perhaps a better term, because it is a from start to finish dealing with digital content. And I would say that in my new job at the University of Sydney, in some ways I got what I asked for, because now I really do have to do all these things, right from the digitisation to the making available and some preservation stuff in between. So sometimes you might need to be careful about espousing, we need to be holistic, because then you get lumped with everything. There have been more discussions around terminology, so let's keep going. Why another model? There are a number of existing models that support digital collections management, from record keeping to archives to digital curation to working in film and sound archives to research data management. This is a non-exhaustive list. But these models are very high level. And if anyone has ever tried to think about implementing a preservation system, these preservation systems base themselves on the OAIS reference model. But how do we apply this? And so I think this is really important, to have that high-level strategic view of what we're doing for our workflows. But how do we actually use that on a day-to-day basis? So what I did is I mapped these models together. This is a little bit of a crosswalk. Again, you're not going to necessarily be able to see it, so take a photo, take it home, and then email me later or tweet at me later and say, can you please put this up there? I did a bit of mapping between these models and realised that my gut feeling when I'd been working in an operational way was that there were some things that we skipped over. And so that gut feeling, luckily, thanks to the Depop project at Cambridge and Oxford, gave me some time to actually turn this into research. And the grey areas there are where these models just didn't necessarily map together. And so what I started to do, and I say it actually means myself locked in a room with Lee and Dave, where I would make a statement, Dave would question me incessantly, and Lee would diagram it up on a whiteboard. We came up with a workflow, which we say is an end-to-end workflow, with 14 different stages. Anything from preparing a range of different content to storing and managing. There are some intentional exclusions, and those exclusions are things like quality control. Quality control should be done at every stage of a process. So let me show you here. So what we have are the most limited number of stages that I could get away with, because I would have had a much longer list. Dave was the person who kept me in check. That borrow from a number of different disciplines. And I think that this is really important, that when we only deal with digital content that comes from all of these different walks of life, when we only deal with it in a particular contextual setting, we might start to increase the silos we already know that we have. So I'm not really going to talk about some of the archival processes, because I think there's probably more archivists in the room than in other discussions that I've been in. The reason why it was so important to illustrate it this way was that stage 8, 9, 10, 11, they're kind of digital preservation tasks, or what's conceived of as digital preservation activities. And we were discussing how that's not where the process really begins. And so organisations that are only moving into this space, we needed to say there's actually a lot of other things that has to happen beforehand. The same with digital humanities. You can't really enable a whole lot of digital humanity research until there's lots and lots of stuff that has happened earlier on. Take a photo of this. There is a DOI that may or may not be readable at the bottom, but this has been written up in a book chapter from the ALCTS, American Library Association, but the particular chapter is in Cambridge's open access repository. So you can go away and read about it a little bit more if you want to. And because I know that this has already been text and diagram heavy, let's just take a breather for a moment and get back down to more of a practical level. This is what an everyday scenario of a digital archive often is. And if it's not there, then it's in the cloud. And the cloud is just someone else's computer or someone else's server. So the first stage of really what are these things on these carriers or on these devices that we have in our back pockets versus these very high-level models, to me that seems like an incredibly vast gap between the two. And how do we get there? So I'm going to push through these things, and Henri will, I'm sure, hurry me up when I've spoken well and truly over time. So, you've yet to see what I've got to say next. So one of these things is just kind of taking a chunk at a time, working your way down through from the high level, or top down, bottom up, whatever it is. And so one of these things was around collection profiling. Again, I didn't do all this work myself. We had categorised the different types of collections within Cambridge University Library into 6 or 7 categories. I kept on trying to shoehorn in the 7th category. The 7th category is both digital and analog audio-visual content. Analog audio-visual content wasn't really considered there, so I kept on slipping it in under the digital banner. But this work was first developed by Grant Young and Jackie Cox, and all I did was extend this particular list of classes. And I would say that when you start to put digital content into a box, it... that one, thank you. So when you start to put, there we go, there are the classes up there on the screen now. When you start to put digital content into boxes, it always spills over. Things cannot easily be divided into this. And so this is another argument, yet again, for working collaboratively, that your research data managers really do need to work with your archivists, who need to work with librarians who are supporting born digital content, etc., etc. We do have to work collaboratively between institutions and also within our own institutions. So that's all well and good, but still, how do I apply this on a day-to-day level? Very quickly, I am going to talk you through the second part of these tools. So the first was that 14-stage model, and then we get into something else which they're both alpha releases, and alpha release means it's not perfect, it's not necessarily correct. Please question me on these things. Mind you, it's never going to be perfect. This second stage of these tools is just a spreadsheet. And it is a spreadsheet of 14 tabs that pretty much, as you will see, is effectively some checklists between those different classes of material and some things that you might need to do. Okay, this is photograph time, and definitely we can have conversations after this, because there will be things that are likely to be highly debatable, possibly incorrect. I'm just going to grab a handful of different stages, and this doesn't necessarily mean that that's all there. So the first one is around acquiring digital content, and you'll see that there's crosses there saying that we can correlate these two things together, and the reason for why all these boxes are not filled in is that different types of locations where digital content is, whether it's on a device in your back pocket or some kind of legacy carrier, means that there are limitations to the ways in which you can transfer content. And so, optical disk imaging is not necessarily going to be useful for needing to do some web archiving. So really, I would say that the list down the left-hand side on this slide and all the other slides that come is the checklist. Okay, so the checklist down the left-hand side is really just, I've started the shopping list, and you can use it, you can throw it away, you can extend it, and this is what it will be for the next couple of slides. So this is really around acquiring digital content. So the next stage is around pre-ingest, and that's a very digital preservation term. I don't expect you all to know it, but it's really a meaning to wrangle digital content before it goes into some kind of digital asset management system or digital preservation system. And visually this looks very different, because once you've got things off carriers, in theory, and this is where this tries to draw together theory and practice, in theory, you should be able to apply the same kinds of processes to a whole lot of content. So there's probably about 24 things on the list here. It doesn't mean you have to do everything. It doesn't mean that you need to process content through each of these stages either, but this just gives you an option for the kinds of things you might want to do, and this helps you to make decisions and prioritise. Then at least you can say, my organisation chooses not to do X, Y and Z, and then you can justify that in your strategic vision, in your policies, in other documentation you create. Let's try and find a better way from switching slides, shall we? Okay. Ingest. People talk about ingesting content into digital asset management systems and preservation systems. And it sounds like this simple thing that you do. And sometimes it can be. But there are many different ways. There is not just one ingest, right? There are at least, there's over half a dozen different types of ingest here. And I will make these slides available because this list is kind of unreadable. So it is useful to say, well, which kind of ingest? Do we want to ingest just via a web upload of a couple of different files, or do we need to build some big back-end processes to do batch ingest? Preserve. I think this is... I have a lot of thoughts on digital preservation. I also think the term doesn't work very well. But preserve just kind of means to keep things for longer than the media on which it was in. And a lot of collections, this is an aside, but a lot of institutions do move content to the cloud at the moment, and that doesn't mean that that is necessarily managed. So I think there's a lot of, yes, we got it off a CD-ROM, but there are a lot of babysitting processes that we need to ensure are put in place. I do think that preserve is probably one of the areas in which we are yet to do a lot of work. A lot of focus has been on ingest, and so there is a lot of activity that needs to happen here, and I think that these kinds of lists will get much longer. And then we sort of, what happens with preserve is that not a lot gets done because people are digitising and making available, and then content gets preserved after we've made things available. So I'd love to have a conversation about, we're making an archive and we're putting it online, and it's the end that I'm often concerned about. And we do often, not always, make content publicly available and very widely available, and it sounds like a simple process again, like just make it available online, or just deliver it or provide access to it. And you can see from this kind of list that again there's about a dozen different ways, and this is where, as Mark referred to, we need to know who our users are and how they want to use things now and how they want to use things in the future. And so this is, as I said, this is far from being anything like what we need, but it's something that will help us bring together those high-level models and some of the procedures and documents that we are creating. So these are considerations, and these are also my concerns. And so this is a little bit bitsy, but I do think we need to maintain a holistic view. I think if you break up the puzzle, yes, you do need to break things down into bite-sized chunks in order to actually do some things. But if you don't have an understanding of what's upstream and downstream, then how do you know what you're doing is processing content in a way that actually enables the next stage? You see it a lot with, say, digitising audio-visual content, that people need to go back and potentially, or just digitising any content, redo things because there are new uses and new ways that researchers and people want to gain access to content. I would say that we need to question and continually question all these assumptions. So anything that I've set up here today, question me on it, because I don't necessarily think that this is the answer to everything. I do think that we need to continue to ensure that we are evidencing and basing whatever we're doing on evidence, and also evolving practices. The way we would have done things 20 years ago is quite different to the way that we are handling things today in practice, possibly not in theory. So challenge our understandings of workflows, make sure that the theory and the practice come together, and I think that's my value. My value of having worked in Cambridge and also in Australia is I do feel, this is my opinion, that Australia is quite heavily operational, and the UK, in my experience again, was quite heavily theoretical, and I think to bring those two worlds together is far more useful than having one or the other, right? If we only theorise, we never get anything done. Borrow from other disciplines too. I learn a lot from research data managers, and I do hope that vice versa, they learn a lot from me. Breaking down the silos, so working together. I know that we are sometimes in competition with each other, but there is simply too much work to do. And so rather than me writing the same procedure at this organisation and you writing the same procedure at another organisation, then please share these tools if you have the opportunity to do so. I do think that, I will come to this last comment, but I do have one or two more things that I want to say, which is that one of my problems with this workflow model, and I will say it right up front, is that digital content can sit unmanaged for weeks, months, usually years, before it's put into some kind of managed preservation, storage or system. And I don't think this model works if preservation and store and manage are stage 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So there's a problem right up front with this. So definitely let's find a different way of doing things. Maybe there is a need for some kind of pre and post processing managed storage, which is, and I do think that there are conversations happening around this. And I do think that organisations don't understand the depth of and frustration with which data wrangling needs to happen in order to, I wouldn't necessarily say control your digital content, but just bring it into a little bit more order so that you've got an idea of the size and shape of the beast. Perfect is the enemy of the good. I've spent some time with Kate Murray at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and this was very much Kate's mantra, and so Kate from FADGI in the Library of Congress. And I think that that's really important to remind yourself on a daily basis, that I have not put up something that I necessarily feel 100% comfortable with presenting, but I do think that it's a starting point, and then we can all iteratively contribute or get rid of things that I've put in there, or it helps us all move along. So one of the other things that I would like to do going forward is to turn this into a circular diagram. Couldn't find an extra half a day to go from a linear workflow diagram to something that is more representative of continually managing digital content. So yeah, there are many things to be done, and maybe that can become a beta release. So I think that's enough, and we will skip to questions after the next presenter. Thank you.
Many thanks, Somaya. I think we'll have many questions. I mean, this link between the theoretical and the practical is, I think, an essential part of our profession, and I think we really have to deal with it. And I like the expression, the best is the enemy of the good, because it certainly is, I do believe. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Catherine Dan, who will present us her paper on data analysis and and I will move back to the front.
I'd like to start by acknowledging also that we meet on Kaurna country. Pay my respects to the custodians of the land, elders past, present and emerging, and also to acknowledge that I now live and work on Ngunnawal land, and to pay my respects to their elders also. This paper is co-authored, and I'd also like to say that I'm one, not two. So Ingrid Mason from the Australian Academic and Research network is unable to be here, but we put this together, and it is very much about a joint project and a project of many people. I will be speaking about a lot of technology that I have no experience of in this paper, but you will see as we go along that this is a project that has many different parts and contributors. So the Australian National University Archives, where I'm University Archivist, is a major research archives with strengths in the records of large business and small companies, trade unions, pastoral stations, independent associations, personal papers, Pacific Research Archives, and I have much to talk with Mark about, the National HIV/AIDS Collection, a strength in Southeast Asian studies, and also the archives of the university itself. We have a collection of around 20 kilometres of physical records built over the last 60 years and hold records dating from the 1820s to today. Like many archives, we have programs to digitise records for accessibility and preservation. And today I'm going to talk about a sort of a slice of what Somaya was talking about, a digitisation and accessibility project. It's a project to enhance accessibility and research usefulness of a particular set of records, using digitisation as the first step to a form of digital access. The ultimate aim is to unlock the potential of these archives by moving from digitised items, which is what a lot of our digitisation is, to a corpus of data based on archives. So today I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of this particular project about the Sydney Stock Exchange registers, where we aim to take business records from the Noel Butland Archives Centre at ANU and make them accessible as data for researchers. I'm going to cover our background with digitisation projects, talk about what it is that we're dealing with here, the Sydney Stock Exchange registers, talk about the project partners and our objectives, and provide an overview of what has been accomplished to date, where, if we're lucky, we're probably about halfway through. It has taken perhaps longer than we expected, and I'm going to reflect on where next. Before going further, I really would like to acknowledge the people who have made this project happen. It is not me. I've been lucky to come in partway through and to be part of the excitement of where we are now. But the project was imagined by the university librarian, Roxanne Missingham, my predecessor as university archivist, Maggie Shapley, and our ARNet partner, Ingrid Mason, and it has also had quite a lot of critical input from Dr. Mark Wilson in the ANU College of Business and Economics, and it's involved project team members from our digitisation team, Erin Gallant and Stephanie Luke, input from archivist Sarah Lethbridge, and the key person in all of this is our historian hacker, Dr. Tim Sherratt. While the Noel Butland Archives Centre provides the core archival material, it's actually the process of enriching the digitised archive to provide an opportunity for data analysis and exploring new research questions, which is the core of what we're trying to do. So, our past experience. The archives is part of the Scholarly Information Services Division, so that takes in the university libraries, the ANU Press and the archives program. We also have within that structure a digital scholarship team, and they actually coordinate or do the digitisation projects that happen in the library or the archives. We do a small amount in the archives, but really most of it is through that team. So they were initially funded on a project basis, and they've really been up and running since 2016 and commenced as most university digitisation or institutional repository projects start, they started with theses. The archives prior to that had undertaken digitisation, but we now joined this broader scheme. And the digital objects, the archives that have been digitised, are made available from the data repository, which is based on DSpace. So from the earliest times that the digitisation team were up and running, the archives was putting forward proposals for material to be digitised. Each digitisation project that happens at ANU in the Library and Archives is based on a business case where we take into account researcher interest, user demand, the importance of the material, the readiness for digitisation, it's never ready enough, copyright and access conditions. Our objective is to make any digitised items available via our open research repository, so we are always trying to concentrate on open access material rather than anything that has restrictions. To date, the program has digitised just under 53,000 items, including photographs, publications, audio-visual material, posters, correspondence, research papers. What I would call archival material has included around 45,000 items, and many of those are actually multiple images. And as I said, the material's made available via the Open Research Repository. So that's just an image of the front page of the Open Research Repository, and you'll see that the Library and Archives collections are in the middle. We also have, theses are now lodged straight into the digital repository. Our objective, as I said, is to make available for use. But along the way, we've had to consider how we present the digitised. And we've made choices about how that happens. Some of those choices are undeniably limited by the ability of the technology. So the current interface that we have is not perfect. It's not as we would like it. It's not visual enough. But, there's a whole other paper in that. The digitised that we make available from the archives is also only ever partial. And so our decisions about how we present it can potentially limit, or it can engage users. So our past presentation's been quite straightforward. We use Atom, A2M, as our archival control system, and then present the digitised items via the institutional repository infrastructure. But we have tried some different ways of making things accessible. So our first foray into different methods of access and presentation was to do with the Tooth & Company, which was a large brewing company, what we call the yellow index cards. These yellow cards are index cards about hotels throughout New South Wales, and they were created by the brewing business as a way of tracking their business and also competitors. As well as being significant records of the management of that business, they're a really rich resource for social and local history, and very popular with users. They're all intimately bound with place, so when we had digitised those cards, we undertook a project to provide access via a map. It's an alternative way of reaching the digitised archive that made sense for users. So essentially, you can locate a place, you can zoom in, you can then link to the digitised card, which gives you a photograph of the hotel and information about the running of that hotel. So this was, really exciting for us to make, the digitised fairly static, a bit more interesting and a different way in for the user. What we want to do now is to go a step further and to present digitised images as data content. We're working with the Australian Stock Exchange daily price registers. So this is just a picture of a page from one of those. You'll see more. As a joint project between the Australian National University and AARNet, Australia's Academic and Research Network, the project objectives have been technical, intellectual and research. So we expect benefits for the ANU archives in experimenting with a new way of working with digitised material, making it available, seeing how it can be made available, for the digitisation program in some of their workflows, for AARNet in looking at this project and their infrastructure, and for the digital humanities research community. So, we aim to hypothesise, to test and to demonstrate techniques of data extraction that will enhance and also demonstrate the research potential in digitised archival sources. We've also tested data transfer and digitisation workflows, looking at large-scale data transfer, lots of objects, using AARNet's cloud store for file sharing, looking at integration with Jupyter Notebooks about what we were doing and what the code is. We're also wanting to test and prove techniques and software about automating processes, whether that's transcription, so handwriting recognition, or actually the processing of what we have digitised. And we want to use this hopefully as a bit of a case study about experimenting with doing this kind of thing and working towards making digitised archives available more as data as well as digitised objects. So, a little bit more into what we're actually doing. So, the archives we're working with are the Sydney Stock Exchange stock and share lists from 1901 to 1950. And this is a description that you will find of them in our archives database, ATOM. Just to give you a bit of background, the Sydney Stock Exchange was formed in 1871 to allow brokers and traders to trade stocks and bonds for companies listed in New South Wales. It formed an association with stock exchanges in Adelaide, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth and Hobart, called the Australian Associated Stock Exchanges, but it remained an independent body. But then the 6 stock exchanges amalgamated in 1987 and became the Australian Stock Exchange Limited, which people would know today. So we've digitised 199 large format bound volumes of the official lists of stock and share prices. These were stock and share prices that were posted up for the public to see at the Sydney Stock Exchange call room. They were posted every trading day, 3 times a day, so morning, noon and afternoon. And the closing prices were entered by hand on pre-printed sheets that were then bound into the volumes. So we're talking about 70,000 pages that we digitised. That's how the result of digitisation appears in open research. So you will see, there is a description of what they are, and then you have to scroll down to get to the particular digitised images. And that's what a page looks like. So 70,000 of those pages digitised. Is it actually of value? We know from economic historians that the information in the registers does have research value, though I would have to say I think it's rather underutilised, although Maggie has a wonderful story of presenting an image like this when she was speaking at an economic history conference, just grabbed a page of something to show, and was greeted at the end by a very excited economic historian who was excited because this was a very rich, concentrated research for his research, a source for his research. he'd been going through newspapers where some of the prices were published and transcribing all of those in order to create something along these lines. So we know these things do have value. They cover a period which includes 2 world wars and a depression. So there is a lot of concentrated data about the state of the economy. But really our question is, rather than having to go through page by page, is there a way that we can deconstruct this and provide it as a way that it can be, in a way that it can be analysed as data, while still honouring the original and ensuring that the researcher can connect back to that source, to the context of this particular page, and the other sources that we have in the archives. The trade union records from the same period that might reflect on the economic history. So what we're looking to do is turn what is really a tabular presentation in the register into a table of data to enable data mining. So that's the raw material. Hopefully you can see some of the detail. You can see the embedded data there. So at the top, it gives you the session, it gives you the date. There are columns with headings for the different sectors and the names of firms. There are columns where the buying and selling price have been written in. So that's the raw material. And this is what we are in the process of doing. So the steps are really to digitise and extract metadata, to convert the ledger to data using column and header detection and row detection, to do what we can to recognise text, so to use some manual transcription, but then to automate where we can. We're looking at days, dates and session times, and then we're at about that point currently. Then we want to go further with automated recognition of other parts of the page and run that across the full set, and then really see where we go from there. Sort of develop and test methods that then that data might be visualised or used. Down the bottom is a very important link. So if you want to know anything about this project, there is a Jupyter notebook where Tim Sherratt has been capturing, and others have been capturing comments about what we have been doing during this project, but it also has information about the coding that he's done, the software that he's used, clues about, this had a lot of trial and error and so on, and what worked and what didn't. So you will see where we're up to, but we will continue to work on this in the coming year, and so you can continue to follow along. So first thing, digitise. It's fair to say that at that digitisation stage, there was a lot to learn about the infrastructure of moving things around. So the digitisation was undertaken by a sort of a third party, and then files were loaded to the cloud. We tested a lot of things to do with that actual loading and workflows. So ARNet learnt a lot based on the fact that their infrastructure had been very much built on assumptions of scientific data, where there were a few files or very large sets of data. We had much smaller sizes of data, but many, many more files. So, there were some learnings about how, sorry, I used that word, learnings. There were some things that we learned about how the infrastructure copes with that sort of multiple file transmission. We used ARNet services of CloudStore and FileSender, and they worked, but in the process we looked at some different tools to enable taking the files, for example, directly off a hard drive and into the cloud storage, so that they could then be manipulated by Tim Sherratt. As a result of some of that work, AARNet has looked at enhancing some of their instructional material and educational material that they have about how researchers use this sort of infrastructure. So, digitise. And what you see on the right is the sort of the extraction of metadata that Tim took from loading all the files up into Cloud Store with the metadata and then stripping it out. Next, what he did was looking at dividing the page into columns. So this involved a lot of trial and error, because you have to find the lines, you know, the image might not be as strong as it needs to be, there might be gaps in the lines, the page might be ever so slightly tilted, or the line might be tilted, there are different size gutters, there are gaps, there are skewed pages, and so what he was trying to do was get a machine to recognise all these things that we can see very clearly with the human eye and we adjust for. So that human knowledge actually helped with setting the parameters more clearly. And again, the code that Tim used to do this is available in the Jupyter Notebook. This is an example of some of his comments as he went along about the way of dividing things into columns. The reason we want to do this is so that you can basically split the page into like the cells in an Excel spreadsheet, and then you can extract the data. So that's the sort of thing he struck. The output at this stage then was a set of saved images with the headers and the columns that was then going to be built on. So then Tim split the pages by year and saved each year with the columns and the headers into a CSV for further processing. So the sorts of things that were in that CSV, you know, the directory, things like the reference code, which is the archive's number, you know, the series N193, which volume it was, which page, and dates, and a whole lot of other material that had come from our metadata. Just before I go on to that. So then Tim did some visualisation of what had we actually found by splitting things into columns. What this is showing you is he ran something over the top to say, well, you know, what's the result? How many pages of our 70,000 had 3 columns? How many pages had 4 columns? How many had 2? How many had 1? How many had 0? With the idea being that if you have 1 column, or if you have 0 columns, you've actually got a problem. There's something that is not quite right about that. And the sorts of things that, that came through when he looked at those 6 columns were things such as a handwritten page, a page that had been compressed. So we went back to the original and worked out what had happened. Or a pamphlet that had been digitised as part of the work, because the digitisation started at the front of the ledger and went all the way through to the back, but somebody had put in an extra publication, and that had been digitised as well. He also did some visualisation, some pretty pictures, as well as being pretty. It did help with being able to just spot errors as you went along. So what this actually is a stack of how many columns there are on each page. So then we started on the rows. So Tim again used Tesseract software, which is like OCR software, to help recognise where those rows were. And then we started with the transcription. So we wanted to find out the sessions. So we've did a sample of transcription of the day and the date. Here is an example of some of the questions that we have a couple of interns at this time who transcribed based on those little rows for a couple of the year's worth of pages in order to work out what was happening. This led Tim into a little side project of working out when were the public holidays, because there were days that were odd. You know, why were there no sessions on that day? So he has produced, and it's a useful tool for anyone who needs to know this, all of the public holidays in New South Wales between 1901 and 1950. And there are very odd things like, or things that you might not expect, you know, a visit of a US fleet, and it's a public holiday, a death in the royal family, a visit of someone from the royal family. Again, did visualisation to work out where are the anomalies? Is this what we expect? Oh, something odd is happening here. And you'll see in this example from 1901, we did a little bit of transcription. He then ran it across a whole lot of pages with what had been learned from the transcription, and could then pick up where there was an anomaly and make a note about what had gone on. And again, tried a different method of visualising, and you can see here, and actually we can drill down into any of this. So the visualisations are interactive. You can see it, and then you can go into the actual page that it represents. So we're at the stage now where he's running that over the 70,000 pages. That will help. So instead of somebody actually working all of this out, that will work it out across the rest of the pages. And then we will start on the really hard stuff, which is the company names and the prices. Because as you might remember from the beginning, those prices were handwritten. They're much more idiosyncratic. So that's where we're really going to be testing the transcription, folding into automation to see how that works. So, what have we learnt so far? It's not an easy task, and it really does take time, but I think the results are really quite exciting. We're already looking at this and saying, oh, this is a really great way to present it to users. We can now provide them with another access point. We're learning things about the automation of the process and how you can use visualisation to detect anomalies really quickly, rather than having to look through spreadsheets and spreadsheets of metadata, which is part of our lives for many of us. And you can use, we have learnt that you can use a small set of transcription to actually train for more automated application. So we are closer to achieving a data set from these archival records, but we're not quite there yet. So do follow along at home. And we're hopeful that when we get to the end, the sorts of things that we've learned from this can then be applied to other records. For example, we've recently digitised some meteorological registers from CSR, a sugar company. Similar sort of thing, very standard format, but handwriting. But just think what we could do about visualising some of that climate data. We're almost at the stage of re-engaging with some of our academic colleagues to talk to them about how far we've got now and how they see it being used. And I hope that that will kind of lead us in other directions as well. So, I would encourage you to follow along at home. Do go and have a look at Tim's notebook, And if you have any questions about the project, I'm very happy to answer them. But if it is about the code, I'm going to go straight to Tim. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Catherine, for this very innovative project, and that opens these huge perspectives. So, do we have questions now? We have about 10 minutes. So on either of the three papers, case studies, or just, general reflection based on case studies and going back between theoretical and the practical.
It's not a question. I just wanted to ask you to put the previous screen back up so we can take a photo of the contact details.
The previous screen back.
It's too quick for me.
Can we put the previous screen back?
Oh, sorry.
No,
Yep.
Yeah.
That one?
that one over
Yep.
there. Thank you
Sure.
very much.
I've got a question for Mark. John Schilling from the National Archive. We all know we've got a responsibility to look after the data that we've been entrusted with and to make it available over time. But I'm wondering, your slide where you showed the unidentified people in photos, do we have a responsibility to try to get the remaining people in the public who are alive to identify people that are in our images, and what way can we do that?
Kia ora, thanks for your question. Yes, I think we do have a responsibility to try and identify people represented in the collections. At the National Library of New Zealand, we have a policy called Te Mori o Te Mataranga, which represents from a Māori worldview that representations of people have a wairua or a spirit or a life force. And from a Māori worldview also, the relationship between the people who have passed and people who haven't, people who have died and people who are alive is permeable. So you speak to an ancestor as though they were alive. So I think there is a responsibility, and I'm really hoping that as part of this project, we can acknowledge a lot of those biases and a lot of those problems, I think, in our collections relating to Pacific people, and use the project to build the networks to help do that identification work. And so, how we go about doing that, I think we will hopefully utilise our co-design group to maybe design some aspects of the service to do that, or we work with partners, so whether they're the organisations who are contributing to the service or whether they are museums, archives, libraries in the Pacific or around the region to help us identify people, even though they might not be contributing images to the service. So I kind of see it as like a critical bit of infrastructure around societal memory that enables us to engage more widely across the Pacific to address that issue and address that challenge among others.
Hi, I'm Catherine from the National Archives in the UK. Catherine, question for you. You mentioned, in the outline, you mentioned crowdsourced transcriptions. Was that just the students that were involved? Could you tell us a bit more about how you went about that?
Yeah, we actually didn't crowdsource as much as we, I think, had originally thought we might. So our crowdsourcing was actually an internal crowd of two. Who are a couple of interns who started working with us, and we gave it to them as one of the duties. I'm not sure if we will need to do more at the next stage, and I'm not sure, I think what they did was quite straightforward because it was, session and date. The prices might be a little trickier, I don't know. And yeah, so we haven't gone there yet. It's something I would still really like to pursue a bit more broadly. So yeah, I know lots of others have much more extensive experience in the crowdsourcing area, but I think it's something we'd like to work out. How might we do that?
Detlev from the National Archive of Australia. I've got another question for you, Catherine. I'm just interested, did you... how much investigation did you do before you started that research, see what commercial providers are actually already doing in that field. I'm thinking particularly some of the other business files are getting digitised by a number of companies in Australia. They've got some systems in place that already do that metadata capture, and I'm just wondering whether, what sort of level of investigation you did.
We didn't do a lot because we actually wanted to experiment for ourselves and to see what the sort of capacity was and flexibility was for ourselves. I think also we're not just doing metadata extraction, we're actually wanting to look at how might we do this with this kind of material. So, but I will be honest, we didn't investigate that very much, I don't think.
Is there a last question? We must have professional situations that are quite comparable or different from what was presented by our colleagues. If that's not the case, I mean, I'll invite you to... There was a question. Perfect. It will be the last question because we're reaching the end of our session.
I don't have a very articulate question, but it's mainly for Somaya. Hi, Somaya. We worked together on Depot a few years ago in Sydney. I'm from Prince Alfred College Archives, but formerly State Library of South Australia. I just wondered, thank you for your presentations, I just wondered whether you thought how much is there a gap for organisations to understand the difference between preservation and digitising, as in digital preservation and digitising, and what needs to be done, perhaps what you recommend.
You've given me 2 minutes to answer that question. Not at all. This is a good time frame to keep. I do think that there are big conceptual gaps because I think, and Catherine's talked about what digitising means. So in my current role, I oversee some still image digitisation processes, and that is not a simple thing to do in itself. Quality checking or quality control checking takes a long time when you're starting off with your sample sets. So I think it's very easy to say digitisation, digital preservation, what are all these terms? But when you start to do the practice, and this is where rolling up your sleeves and actually trying to do something, you learn by doing so much. And I'm an advocate for a day in the life, putting yourself in someone else's shoes. So switching someone that's typically in a managerial role, doing some operational stuff and actually seeing what that means. I know that sometimes that's a bit of a controversial statement, but I've got the microphone, so I'm going to say it, right? That I do think that there is a gap there, and when we put in a business case to procure a digital preservation system, and you get project managers that say we can do it in this time frame but don't necessarily understand this particular system, and the standards are not necessarily there in this particular system, then we've all seen timeframes blow out and costs blow out, and I would say that's what I'm talking about in so many shapes and sizes, is that gap. So yes, absolutely, let's continue this conversation because I think we need to find ways. And so this, what I proposed, it's just one thing to try and link the very high level with the detail. So yeah, but if you don't talk, I'm not going to keep to time, but if you don't think about what's the next step down the line, it's very easy to just digitise and not then go, oh, but then how are we going to put it into the system? Oh, we need to batch load it. In theory, that's an easy thing to do. In practice, if you haven't set up all the other information that you need as part of your submission information package, so it is an information package, it's not just a set of digitised files, then you're not going to be able to batch load it. And so this happens continually down the line for another 14 odd stages or whatever it is. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all three speakers. I ask you to join me in giving them. Thank you so much.